Imagine a name that should echo through an entire century, and yet silence. Ivan Kozhedub, the most successful Allied pilot. 3 gold stars, and almost complete oblivion around him. Why did this happen? Who and for what reason erased him from memory? In declassified reports, there are strange episodes that were hidden for years. An incident over Berlin where allies suddenly turned into opponents. Stories of how personal achievements were handed over to the system while inconvenient details disappeared from records. Textbooks kept polished lines while the truth slipped into the shadows. We gathered rare facts, testimonies of comrades, and forgotten notes to restore the path of a man who turned the sky into his own chessboard. At the end, you will hear a version from closed investigations of why his name remained quieter than it should have been. Watch until the end. The details change everything. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Obrachayevka. Even the name feels forgotten, lost among the countless villages that dot the Ukrainian steppe. In 1920, as civil war raged across the collapsing Russian Empire, this small settlement witnessed the birth of a boy who would one day command the skies above a burning continent. Ivan Nikitovich Kozhedub entered a world already marked by violence and upheaval. His father, Nikita, worked the land with calloused hands, watching helplessly as political storms swept away the old certainties. Collectivization would soon transform their village, turning individual farms into collective enterprises under the watchful eye of the state. The boy grew up amid these transformations, but his eyes increasingly turned skyward. While other children played with wooden toys, Ivan crafted model airplanes from scraps of wood and paper. His fingers seemed to understand the principles of flight before his mind could articulate them. By his teenage years, the fascination had crystallized into obsession. Aviation represented something pure to him, a realm where skill and courage mattered more than political connections or family background. The sky promised equality of a sort that Earth could never provide. When Soviet aviation schools began recruiting young men from rural backgrounds, Ivan saw his chance. The state needed pilots, and he needed purpose. The marriage seemed destined, but the path from village boy to fighter pilot demanded more than enthusiasm. The Chuguyev Military Aviation School, where Ivan enrolled, operated like a crucible designed to break the weak and forge the strong. Physical demands pushed candidates beyond their limits. Mental pressure tested their resolve. Technical requirements separated the naturally gifted from the merely determined. Ivan possessed both gifts and determination. His instructors noted his unusual ability to visualize three-dimensional movement, to think in terms of angles and velocities while maintaining the split-second reflexes combat demanded. More importantly, they observed something harder to quantify, a coldness under pressure that suggested natural killer instincts. Not the bloodlust of a sadist, but the calculating precision of a predator. The difference would prove crucial in the battles ahead. During training flights, Ivan demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to position his aircraft for maximum advantage. While other cadets struggled with basic maneuvers, he seemed to intuitively grasp the geometry of aerial combat. His gunnery scores consistently topped his class, but instructors noted something more valuable than mere accuracy. He never wasted ammunition. This economy of violence would become his signature. Every shot calculated, every movement purposeful. No energy expended without clear tactical benefit. Upon graduation, the newly minted pilot received assignment to a fighter regiment. But fate had other plans. The year was 1941, and across the border, Wehrmacht divisions massed for the largest invasion in human history. Dawn broke across the Soviet frontier on June 22, 1941, shattering more than the morning quiet. Operation Barbarossa unleashed 3 million German soldiers, supported by the most experienced air force in the world. The Luftwaffe had honed its skills over Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. Soviet pilots, by contrast, had limited combat experience and inferior equipment. The initial onslaught caught Soviet aviation completely unprepared. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground before their pilots could even reach them. Those that managed to take off often flew obsolete machines against battle-tested German veterans in superior aircraft. Ivan Kozhedub watched this catastrophe unfold from the relative safety of a training base in the rear. His superiors, recognizing his exceptional flying abilities, assigned him as an instructor, rather than throwing him immediately into the meat grinder consuming Soviet air power. The decision likely saved his life, but it also filled him with frustration. While the Red Army retreated across hundreds of miles, losing entire armies to German encirclement, Ivan taught new pilots basic maneuvers. While cities burned and millions died, he guided nervous cadets through their first landings. The irony ate at him. His country's most naturally gifted pilot was relegated to safe duties, while lesser men died in hopeless battles. But this period of forced inactivity served a purpose beyond mere survival. Ivan studied every after-action report that reached the training base. He analyzed German tactics, noting their formations, their preferred attack patterns, their weaknesses. He memorized the performance characteristics of enemy aircraft, learning to recognize them by silhouette and engine sound. Most importantly, he absorbed the hard lessons bought with Soviet blood. Early war pilots had attacked German formations head-on, relying on courage to overcome tactical disadvantage. The results were predictably catastrophic. Ivan understood that survival required more than bravery. It demanded intelligence, patience, and the willingness to wait for the perfect moment to strike. By 1942, the situation had stabilized enough to allow experienced instructors like Ivan to transfer to combat units. The Red Army had learned to trade space for time, drawing German forces deeper into the Soviet interior while rebuilding its strength. New aircraft were beginning to reach the front lines, not yet equal to German machines, but competent enough to give skilled pilots a fighting chance. Ivan's first combat assignment brought him to the 240th Fighter Air Regiment, flying Lavochkin LA-5 fighters. The LA-5 represented a significant improvement over earlier Soviet designs, though it still required careful handling to compete with German opponents. Its radial engine provided reliable power, and its armament could destroy any aircraft if properly aimed. But it demanded precise flying technique and tactical awareness to survive against seasoned Luftwaffe pilots. The transition from training flights to combat missions revealed new dimensions of warfare Ivan had never experienced. The controlled environment of the training base gave way to chaos and uncertainty. Radio communications crackled with panicked voices. Friendly and enemy aircraft mixed in swirling dogfights that stretched across dozens of miles. The margin between victory and death measured in split seconds and millimeters. Ivan's first combat sortie nearly ended in disaster. Approaching what appeared to be a lone German reconnaissance aircraft, he found himself diving into a carefully prepared trap. Enemy fighters materialized from concealing cloud cover, their cannons already tracking toward his aircraft. Only desperate maneuvering and beginner's luck allowed him to escape with minimal damage. The experience taught him a fundamental lesson about aerial warfare. Appearances deceived. The enemy, who seemed isolated, probably had friends nearby. The empty sky likely contained death waiting to pounce. Survival required constant vigilance and the assumption that every situation was more dangerous than it appeared. The moment that transforms a pilot from student to warrior arrives without fanfare. No ceremonial transition marks the passage from theoretical knowledge to deadly practice. For Ivan Kozhedub, the transformation came during a routine escort mission in the late summer of 1942. His formation was providing cover for ground attack aircraft, striking German positions near Stalingrad. The mission should have been routine: fly high, watch for enemy interceptors, engage only if necessary to protect the bombers. But combat rarely follows the briefing room plan. German fighters appeared suddenly from the sun, diving on the Soviet formation with practiced precision. The sky exploded into chaos as aircraft scattered in all directions, pilots shouting warnings and curses over the radio. Ivan found himself separated from his wingman, alone against multiple enemies closing rapidly from different angles. Training took over where conscious thought failed. His hands moved across the controls without deliberate command, rolling the LA-5 into a defensive spiral while his eyes tracked the nearest threat. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 was closing fast, its pilot clearly experienced and confident. But confidence could become overconfidence. The German pilot committed to a head-on attack, apparently expecting the Soviet pilot to break away at the last moment. Ivan did not break. Instead, he held his course while calculating angles and closure rates with mathematical precision. At exactly the right moment, his thumb found the firing button. The convergence was perfect. 20mm cannon shells walked across the 109's engine cowling and cockpit in a precise line of destruction. The German fighter shuddered, rolled inverted, and dove toward the earth, trailing smoke and flame. Ivan's first victory lasted perhaps 10 seconds from initial firing pass to enemy destruction. But those 10 seconds contained lifetimes of preparation, training, and instinct. They marked the moment when theoretical knowledge became practical skill, when classroom instruction transformed into deadly expertise. More importantly, the engagement revealed the psychological dimension of aerial combat. The moment after destroying his first enemy aircraft, Ivan felt no elation or triumph. Instead, a strange calmness settled over him, as if some final barrier between intention and action had dissolved permanently. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The returning pilots debriefed their mission with the usual mixture of exaggeration and understatement. Victories were claimed, near misses became heroic escapes, and mechanical failures transformed into acts of enemy cunning. But intelligence officers noticed something different about Ivan's report. Where others embellished details or claimed uncertain kills, he provided precise, almost clinical descriptions of the engagement. His wingman confirmed the victory. The German fighter had indeed crashed where Ivan said it would. More significantly, other pilots began noting his unusual tactical awareness. He seemed to see threats before they developed, positioning himself advantageously while enemies still approached from maximum range. This gift for spatial reasoning and tactical prediction would become Ivan's greatest asset. While other pilots relied on superior numbers or equipment to achieve victory, he won through positioning and timing. He fought like a chess master, thinking several moves ahead while opponents struggled to understand the current situation. The first kill established a pattern that would define his entire combat career. Conservative approach, precise execution, clinical aftermath, no wasted motion or emotion. The sky became his office, enemy destruction his profession, but recognition brought responsibility. Squadron commanders began assigning Ivan to increasingly dangerous missions, His growing reputation made him a valuable asset, but also a target. German intelligence tracked successful Soviet pilots, studying their tactics and preparing counters to their methods. The hunt was beginning in earnest. Every great pilot forms an intimate relationship with his aircraft. For Ivan Kozhedub, that relationship was forged with the Lavochkin La-5 and its improved successor, the La-7. These fighters would carry him through most of his combat career, becoming extensions of his own reflexes and instincts. The La-5 was far from perfect. Its radial engine consumed fuel voraciously, limiting range and endurance. The cockpit cramped even average-sized pilots, and visibility could have been better. But the aircraft possessed virtues that matched Ivan's fighting style perfectly. Most importantly, the La-5 was fast and strong. Its radial engine provided reliable power that could be pushed hard without fear of sudden failure. The airframe could withstand tremendous stress during violent maneuvers. When properly handled, it could outrun most German fighters in level flight and outdive any opponent. Ivan learned to exploit these advantages while compensating for the aircraft's weaknesses. He developed techniques for conserving fuel during patrol flights, extending his combat time by managing throttle settings and flight profiles. He mastered the art of using the La-5's superior low-altitude performance to force enemies into disadvantageous positions. More crucially, he perfected his gunnery technique to match the aircraft's armament. The La-5 carried two 20mm cannons with limited ammunition. Every shot had to count. Ivan practiced until he could place shells precisely where intended, even during high-G maneuvers or at extreme range. His maintenance crews marveled at the condition of his aircraft after combat missions. While other fighters returned riddled with bullet holes or showing signs of overstressed engines, Ivan's La-5 typically bore minimal damage. He fought smart, avoiding unnecessary risks and disengaging when tactical advantage shifted against him. This conservative approach frustrated some colleagues who preferred more aggressive tactics. They accused him of lacking fighting spirit or avoiding dangerous missions, but results spoke louder than criticism. Ivan's victory count steadily climbed, while many aggressive pilots ended their careers in smoking craters. The introduction of the improved La-7 in 1944 provided Ivan with an even more capable mount. The new fighter retained all the La-5's strengths while addressing most of its weaknesses. More powerful engine, better high-altitude performance, improved visibility, enhanced maneuverability. In Ivan's hands, the La-7 became a precision instrument of aerial destruction. He could position it exactly where needed, when needed, with the confidence that comes from total familiarity with machine capabilities. The aircraft responded to his intentions as naturally as his own limbs. But the relationship went deeper than mere technical proficiency. Ivan understood that his survival depended on the aircraft's reliability, and he treated it accordingly. He supervised maintenance personally, learning every system and component. He knew exactly how much stress the airframe could handle, how far he could push the engine, how much ammunition remained without looking at gauges. This intimate knowledge paid dividends during critical moments. When enemy fighters pressed their attacks beyond normal limits, Ivan could respond with maneuvers that appeared impossible, but remained within his aircraft's performance envelope. When fuel ran low during extended missions, he could calculate exactly how much fighting time remained. The psychological effect on enemies was significant. German pilots learned to recognize Ivan's aircraft by its markings and flight characteristics. They understood that engaging him meant facing not just a skilled pilot, but a man who knew his machine's capabilities better than they knew their own. Some Luftwaffe pilots reported being unwilling to press attacks against aircraft they suspected were flown by the Soviet ace. The mere possibility of facing him in combat introduced doubt and hesitation that often proved fatal. Ivan's gunnery skills became legendary among Soviet pilots. He could destroy enemy aircraft with ammunition expenditures that seemed impossibly low. While typical pilots might fire hundreds of rounds to achieve a single victory, Ivan often needed fewer than 50. His shells found critical components with surgical precision: engines, control surfaces, fuel systems. The economy of his violence was both practical and artistic. Practical because limited ammunition loads made waste potentially fatal. Artistic because the precise placement of destructive force represented a form of deadly craftsmanship. Ground crews began to notice patterns in the enemy aircraft Ivan shot down. Clean kills, minimal dispersion of damage, strikes concentrated in areas that would cause immediate, catastrophic failure. He was not merely destroying enemies. He was demonstrating mastery of three-dimensional geometry applied to lethal purpose. The battle for Stalingrad transformed aerial warfare on the Eastern Front. What began as a German drive to capture a strategically important industrial city evolved into the largest air campaign in history. Thousands of aircraft clashed above the burning ruins, while hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought for every building below. Even Kozhedub arrived at Stalingrad during the height of the battle, when the outcome remained in doubt and losses mounted catastrophically on both sides. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything into the offensive: veteran fighter pilots, experienced bomber crews, and the latest aircraft technology. Soviet aviation, while improved from the disasters of 1941, still struggled against German tactical superiority. The skies above Stalingrad belonged to whoever could seize them through superior skill and numbers. Control shifted hourly as formations of fighters swept across the battlefield, seeking advantage through position and timing. Bomber streams crossed at multiple altitudes while interceptors climbed to meet them. The air war had become a three-dimensional chess game played at lethal speed. Ivan's tactical abilities found perfect application in this chaotic environment. Where other pilots became confused by the constantly shifting situation, he maintained situational awareness through careful observation and logical analysis. He could track multiple enemy formations while monitoring his own fuel and ammunition status. His first major engagement over Stalingrad demonstrated the evolution of his fighting technique. Leading a 4-aircraft patrol, Ivan spotted a formation of German dive bombers approaching Soviet positions. The bombers were heavily escorted by fighters flying top cover at different altitudes. Rather than attacking immediately, Ivan studied the enemy formation for several minutes. He noted the escort patterns, identified the most experienced pilots by their positioning, and calculated the best approach vector. Then he led his flight in a carefully planned attack that achieved maximum surprise and effectiveness. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, but resulted in 3 confirmed victories for Ivan's flight without loss. More importantly, it prevented the German bombers from reaching their targets, protecting Soviet ground forces from potentially devastating attack. Word of such successes spread quickly through the ranks. Soviet pilots began requesting assignment to Ivan's flights, recognizing that his tactical leadership significantly improved their survival chances. German intelligence, meanwhile, identified him as a priority target whose elimination would benefit their air campaign. The attention brought both opportunities and dangers. Ivan found himself assigned to increasingly critical missions where his tactical skills could provide maximum benefit to Soviet operations. But he also faced more experienced opponents as the Luftwaffe concentrated its best pilots against identified threats. One engagement nearly ended his career. While attacking a formation of German transport aircraft, Ivan's flight was ambushed by fighters that had been concealed in nearby clouds. The enemy pilot leading the attack was clearly a veteran, maneuvering his aircraft with deadly precision and forcing Ivan into a desperate defensive fight. For several minutes, Ivan fought for his life against an opponent who matched his tactical awareness and exceeded his experience. Cannon shells passed within meters of his cockpit, while he threw his LA-5 through violent evasive maneuvers. Only superior aircraft performance and careful ammunition management allowed him to reverse the situation and eventually destroy his attacker. The victory taught him that reputation could become liability. Enemy pilots were studying his tactics, learning to counter his preferred methods, and planning specific strategies to destroy him. Survival required constant evolution of technique and the willingness to abandon successful methods when they became predictable. But Stalingrad also provided Ivan with invaluable experience in large-scale air operations. He learned to coordinate with other flights, to time attacks for maximum tactical effect, and to manage resources during extended campaigns. His understanding of air warfare evolved from individual combat to strategic thinking. The German offensive at Stalingrad ultimately failed, marking the beginning of their long retreat from Soviet territory. Ivan had played a small but significant role in this victory, protecting ground forces and disrupting enemy air operations through precise application of tactical skill. More importantly, he had established himself as one of the Red Air Force's most effective fighter pilots. His victory count was climbing steadily, and his tactical innovations were being studied and copied by other pilots. The village boy from Ukraine was becoming a master of aerial warfare. But the war was far from over, and greater challenges lay ahead. If Stalingrad was the turning point of the war in the east, then Kursk was its climax. In July 1943, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Citadel, a massive offensive designed to regain strategic initiative through the destruction of Soviet armored reserves. The resulting battle would involve millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and the largest concentration of air power ever assembled on a single front. Ivan Kozhedub flew into this maelstrom as part of the 240th Fighter Air Regiment, now equipped with improved LA-5FN fighters. The new aircraft provided better high-altitude performance and increased firepower, making them more competitive with the latest German fighters. But equipment alone could not guarantee victory against the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots flying their best aircraft. The air battle over Kursk developed its own unique characteristics. Unlike earlier campaigns where Soviet aviation operated primarily in a defensive role, Kursk saw aggressive offensive operations designed to seize air superiority through sustained attack. Both sides committed their elite units to the battle, recognizing that control of the skies would determine the outcome of the ground offensive. Ivan found himself flying multiple sorties per day, engaging enemy formations that seemed to arrive in endless waves. The tempo of operations pushed pilots and aircraft to their limits. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep fighters airworthy. Pilots grabbed sleep whenever possible between missions. In this high-pressure environment, Ivan's methodical approach to aerial combat proved invaluable. While other pilots became exhausted and made potentially fatal errors, he maintained the same careful analysis and precise execution that had marked his earlier victories. His ammunition expenditure remained remarkably low, and his aircraft consistently returned undamaged from missions that left others shot full of holes. The battle provided Ivan with his first opportunity to engage the Luftwaffe's most elite units. These formations contained pilots with hundreds of combat missions and dozens of victories. They flew the latest fighter variants and employed tactics refined through years of combat experience. Defeating them required not just skill, but tactical innovation. Ivan began developing new techniques specifically designed to counter veteran opponents. He studied German formation flying, identifying moments of vulnerability when even experienced pilots became predictable. He learned to use the LA-5's unique performance characteristics to force enemies into disadvantageous positions. One engagement became legendary among Soviet pilots. Ivan was leading a 4-aircraft flight when they encountered 12 German fighters at high altitude. The enemy formation included several recognized aces flying Focke-Wulf 190s, arguably the best fighter aircraft in the world at that time. Rather than retreating or calling for reinforcements, Ivan led his flight in a complex attack that divided the German formation and created multiple small engagements. His tactical positioning allowed each Soviet pilot to engage enemies from advantageous positions, while mutual support prevented the Germans from concentrating their superior numbers. The battle lasted nearly 20 minutes and ranged across hundreds of square kilometers as aircraft pursued each other through climbing and diving maneuvers. When it ended, 4 German fighters had been destroyed and the remainder had withdrawn. Ivan's flight suffered no losses, though all 4 aircraft returned with various degrees of damage. The victory demonstrated Ivan's evolution from skilled individual pilot to tactical leader. His ability to coordinate multiple aircraft in complex maneuvers while maintaining situational awareness exceeded that of many squadron commanders. Word of his leadership abilities reached higher headquarters, setting the stage for future promotions. But Kursk also revealed the cost of aerial warfare. Despite tactical victories like Ivan's, both sides suffered enormous losses. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat died in seconds when their luck ran out or their judgment failed. The attrition rate among aircrew exceeded that of any other military specialty. Ivan watched friends and colleagues disappear with disturbing regularity. Men who had shared meals and stories the previous evening simply failed to return from routine missions. Their aircraft would be seen diving toward Earth trailing smoke, or would simply vanish during confused dogfights where nobody could track every participant. The psychological pressure of constant combat began affecting even the most stable pilots. Some became reckless, taking unnecessary risks in pursuit of victories or glory. Others became overcautious, avoiding engagement whenever possible, and contributing little to overall mission success. Ivan maintained his emotional equilibrium through rigid discipline and focus on mission objectives. He refused to personalize combat, viewing enemy destruction as a technical problem requiring precise solution rather than an emotional release. This clinical approach preserved his effectiveness, while others succumbed to combat fatigue. By the end of the Kursk campaign, Ivan's victory total had climbed to over 20 confirmed kills. More importantly, his tactical reputation was spreading throughout the Red Air Force. Flight instructors began studying his methods, and his techniques were being incorporated into official training curricula. The Battle of Kursk ended in decisive Soviet victory, marking the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would fight a defensive war as Soviet forces pressed westward toward Berlin. Even Kozhedub had played a significant role in achieving this strategic success, but his greatest challenges still lay ahead. Success in aerial combat brought Ivan Kozhedub something he had never sought: fame. By the end of 1943, his victory total exceeded 30 confirmed kills, placing him among the Red Air Force's most successful pilots. Soviet propaganda apparatus began taking notice of the young ace from Ukraine. The attention created complications Ivan had not anticipated. Newspaper correspondents requested interviews. Photographers wanted dramatic portraits. Political officers suggested public appearances to boost morale. The quiet, methodical pilot found himself thrust into a role for which he had no training and little enthusiasm. But recognition also brought tangible benefits. Ivan received promotion to squadron command, providing him with greater tactical authority and better aircraft. His personal La-5FN was maintained to higher standards than typical frontline fighters. Ground crews competed for assignment to his maintenance team, recognizing that supporting a successful pilot enhanced their own reputations. The promotion to squadron leader tested Ivan's abilities in new ways. Individual combat skills, while still important, became secondary to tactical planning and personnel management. He needed to coordinate multiple flights, manage pilot assignments, and ensure that his unit maintained effectiveness despite constant personnel turnover. Ivan approached command with the same methodical precision he applied to aerial combat. He studied each pilot under his command, identifying strengths and weaknesses. He developed training programs to improve gunnery accuracy and tactical awareness. Most importantly, he led by example, continuing to fly the most dangerous missions while expecting similar dedication from his subordinates. His squadron quickly developed a reputation for effectiveness that exceeded its numerical strength. Pilots assigned to Ivan's unit showed improved survival rates and higher victory totals. The combination of superior leadership and tactical innovation created a multiplier effect that enhanced overall mission success. But command also exposed Ivan to political pressures he had previously avoided. Senior officers expected him to participate in propaganda activities designed to boost public morale. Political commissars monitored his interactions with subordinates and his compliance with ideological requirements. Ivan navigated these pressures through careful compromise. He participated in selected propaganda activities while avoiding those that might compromise operational effectiveness. He maintained cordial relations with political officers while focusing primarily on military objectives. The balancing act required constant attention, but preserved his freedom to fight the war as he saw fit. The pressure intensified when Ivan was nominated for the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration. The award recognized his exceptional service and placed him among a select group of aviators whose achievements had gained national attention. The ceremony took place in Moscow, far from the mud and chaos of the front lines. Ivan found himself in the Kremlin, wearing dress uniform and standing before senior government officials whose names he recognized from newspapers. The formal presentation contrasted sharply with the intimate violence of aerial combat. But the medal brought more than recognition. It brought expectations. Heroes of the Soviet Union were expected to embody ideals of communist virtue and military excellence. Their public statements were scrutinized for political correctness. Their private behavior was monitored for signs of deviation from approved norms. Ivan accepted these constraints as the price of continued combat effectiveness. The publicity generated by his hero status enhanced his tactical value while creating opportunities to influence broader air warfare doctrine. If playing the role of model hero allowed him to save lives and destroy enemies more effectively, he would play it convincingly. The transformation from individual pilot to public figure marked a turning point in Ivan's war experience. He could no longer simply focus on tactical problems and technical solutions. Every action carried political implications that might affect his ability to serve effectively. But the war continued, and Soviet forces were pressing their offensive across the Ukraine toward the pre-war frontier. Ivan's squadron would play a crucial role in supporting this advance, providing air cover for ground operations while continuing to destroy German air power wherever encountered. The liberation of his homeland was approaching, and Ivan Kozhedub would help lead the way. The spring of 1945 brought unexpected complications to Ivan Kozhedub's war. Soviet forces were driving deep into German territory, while Allied armies approached from the west. The meeting of these massive military formations created confusion along rapidly shifting front lines, where identification of friend and foe became increasingly difficult. On one April afternoon, Ivan was leading a patrol flight near Berlin when his formation encountered unfamiliar aircraft. The sleek fighters bore markings that initially appeared German, but closer inspection revealed American insignia. These were North American P-51 Mustangs, among the most advanced fighters in the Allied inventory. The Mustangs were flying at medium altitude in loose formation, apparently conducting a reconnaissance mission. Ivan's training had taught him to identify all Allied aircraft types to prevent friendly fire incidents. But the doctrine also emphasized that Soviet airspace was sacrosanct, and unauthorized penetration constituted a hostile act regardless of the intruder's nationality. The situation required split-second decision-making under ambiguous circumstances. The American aircraft might be lost, might be conducting legitimate operations in coordination with Soviet ground forces, or might represent a more serious problem. Ivan had no way to communicate with the foreign pilots, and radio protocols provided no guidance for such encounters. Following established doctrine, Ivan attempted to intercept the American formation and direct them away from Soviet-controlled airspace. He approached from an advantageous position, signaling his intentions through standard aerial maneuvers. The response from the Mustang pilots suggested either misunderstanding or deliberate hostile intent. What happened next became the subject of official investigation and diplomatic protest. According to Ivan's report, the American pilots opened fire first, forcing him to respond in self-defense. The engagement was brief but decisive. 2 P-51s were shot down before the remaining aircraft withdrew toward Allied lines. American sources told a different story. Their pilots reported being attacked without warning by Soviet fighters despite following approved flight paths and conducting legitimate reconnaissance. They claimed the engagement represented unprovoked aggression by an ally who should have recognized their peaceful intentions. The incident created diplomatic tension between allies already struggling to coordinate their final offensive against Germany. American officials demanded an explanation and apology. Soviet authorities defended their pilots' actions while expressing regret over the misunderstanding. Ivan found himself at the center of an international controversy that threatened to overshadow his military achievements. Intelligence officers questioned him repeatedly about the engagement, seeking evidence to support the official Soviet position. Political commissars briefed him on appropriate responses to potential foreign inquiries. The investigation revealed the complexity of modern air warfare between allied nations. Radio frequencies were not coordinated. Recognition signals differed between air forces. Flight paths were not deconflicted at tactical level. The systems designed to prevent such incidents had failed completely. But the political implications extended beyond operational considerations. Soviet-American relations were already showing strain as victory over Germany approached. The incident provided ammunition for those who questioned whether the alliance could survive the defeat of their common enemy. Ivan's reputation suffered damage among some Allied personnel who viewed him as a pilot willing to attack friendly aircraft. His victory total, which had reached an unprecedented level, was questioned by those who suggested some kills might have been misidentified Allied planes rather than German enemies. The controversy followed him for the remainder of the war and into peacetime service. Some historians would later argue that the incident represented calculated Soviet aggression designed to test Western resolve. Others maintained that it was simply an unfortunate consequence of inadequate coordination between Allied air forces. Ivan himself rarely discussed the engagement publicly, maintaining that he had followed proper doctrine under difficult circumstances. He expressed regret over the loss of Allied aircrew, while defending the necessity of protecting Soviet airspace from unauthorized intrusion. The incident highlighted the challenges facing military professionals caught between tactical requirements and political considerations. Ivan's primary responsibility was to his mission and his men, but his actions had consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. As the war entered its final phase, such complications would become increasingly common. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was already showing cracks that would define the post-war world. Ivan Kozhedub had inadvertently become a symbol of the tensions that would shape the coming Cold War. The final months of the war brought Ivan Kozhedub back to familiar territory. Soviet forces were advancing through his native Ukraine, liberating towns and cities that had endured years of occupation. For Ivan, these missions carried personal significance beyond their tactical importance. Flying over landscapes he had known since childhood, Ivan could see the devastation that war had brought to his homeland. Villages were reduced to rubble. Agricultural fields were scarred by trenches and shell craters. The peaceful countryside of his youth had been transformed into a wasteland of destruction. But liberation also revealed the scope of German crimes against the civilian population. Concentration camps, mass graves, destroyed cultural monuments. The systematic attempt to erase Ukrainian identity and replace it with German colonial administration had failed, but at enormous cost to those who had suffered under occupation. Ivan's squadron participated in the final destruction of German resistance in Eastern Europe. Enemy air power had been reduced to scattered remnants, but these surviving units often fought with desperate courage. Some of Ivan's most dangerous encounters occurred during this period, as experienced German pilots made last-ditch attempts to protect their retreating forces. The nature of air warfare was changing as Germany's position became hopeless. Soviet pilots now enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority and generally superior equipment. But the remaining German pilots were veterans who had nothing left to lose, making them unpredictable and extremely dangerous opponents. Ivan's tactical approach evolved to address these new conditions. Rather than seeking individual glory through dramatic engagements, he focused on systematic destruction of remaining enemy capabilities. His missions emphasized efficiency over excitement, seeking to eliminate threats with minimum risk to Soviet personnel. By April 1945, Ivan's victory total had reached 62 confirmed kills, making him the highest-scoring Allied fighter pilot of the war. The achievement represented years of careful development from village boy to master of aerial warfare. But the number alone could not capture the full scope of his contribution to victory. More significantly, Ivan had helped develop tactical innovations that improved survival rates for all Soviet pilots. His emphasis on careful preparation, precise execution, and resource conservation had been incorporated into training curricula throughout the Red Air Force. Hundreds of pilots owed their lives to techniques he had pioneered. His influence extended beyond individual tactics to strategic thinking about air power employment. Ivan understood that fighter aviation's primary mission was not accumulating personal victories, but achieving air superiority that enabled ground forces to operate effectively. His approach emphasized mission accomplishment over personal recognition. The war's end brought mixed emotions for Ivan. Professional satisfaction at having served effectively was tempered by awareness of the enormous cost in human lives. He had survived when many friends and colleagues had not. The randomness of survival in aerial combat left him questioning whether his success represented skill, luck, or some combination of both. Victory also brought uncertainty about the future. Ivan's entire adult life had been shaped by wartime requirements. His skills were honed for destroying enemies and leading men in combat. The transition to peacetime service would require adaptation to new roles and responsibilities. But perhaps most challenging was the growing political attention his achievements had attracted. Ivan's success made him valuable to Soviet propaganda efforts, but also dangerous to those who preferred collective credit over individual recognition. The balance between celebrating heroism and maintaining ideological purity would prove increasingly difficult to maintain. The Great Patriotic War had ended in complete victory for the Soviet Union and its allies. Ivan Kozhedub had played a significant role in achieving that victory, but he was about to discover that peacetime presented challenges as complex as any he had faced in combat. The silence that would eventually surround his achievements was already beginning to descend. Victory brought Ivan Kozhedub face to face with a problem no amount of combat training had prepared him to solve: what to do when the shooting stops. The Red Air Force suddenly found itself without a clear mission or obvious opponents. For Ivan, the transition proved jarring. His days had been structured around combat missions and immediate survival requirements. Peacetime service offered neither clear purpose nor measurable results. Assignment to air defense duties placed Ivan in command of interceptor units protecting Soviet airspace from potential Western threats. Instead of seeking and destroying enemies, he now prepared for hypothetical conflicts that might never materialize. The sky that had once been his hunting ground became a domain requiring constant vigilance but offering little action. More challenging was the bureaucratic environment surrounding peacetime military service. During the war, results had mattered more than procedures. Peace brought renewed emphasis on political correctness, proper documentation, and ideological conformity. The political climate was shifting in ways that affected all veterans. Stalin's regime, having achieved victory over fascism, now turned attention to consolidating domestic control. Heroes who had been celebrated during wartime suddenly found their loyalty questioned and achievements scrutinized. Ivan navigated these waters through careful political balancing. He participated in required ideological training while maintaining professional standards. The strategy worked, but at personal cost. The pilot who had once made split-second life-or-death decisions now had to consider political implications before taking routine administrative actions. Education provided partial escape. Ivan enrolled in the Zhukovsky Air Force Academy, where studies in aerodynamics and aircraft design connected his combat experience with theoretical knowledge. But even education carried political risks from those who viewed his practical expertise as threatening. Ivan's graduation with highest honors opened new opportunities. His combination of combat experience and advanced education made him an obvious candidate for senior air defense command positions, coordinating entire fighter regiments instead of flying individual missions. Success demanded different qualities than those that had made him an effective fighter pilot. Political sensitivity became as important as tactical expertise. Ivan adapted with characteristic precision, studying organizational theory and personnel management with the same intensity he had once devoted to aerial gunnery. By the early 1950s, Ivan held senior positions among the most influential officers in Soviet military aviation. But influence came with constraints. Political considerations often overrode military logic. The system that had elevated him also restricted his freedom to implement necessary reforms. The frustrations were balanced by opportunities to influence the next generation of Soviet pilots through teaching assignments. His emphasis on precise technique and resource conservation became standard elements of fighter pilot training. But even teaching carried risks in Stalin's increasingly paranoid atmosphere. The line between effective military training and political deviation grew narrow. Ivan maintained his position through careful compromise, watching other veterans disappear into the Gulag system for seemingly minor offenses. Stalin's death in 1953 brought gradual changes, but also new uncertainties. For Ivan, the post-Stalin era offered opportunities to play more active roles in military aviation development, but also exposed him to new forms of political scrutiny. The balancing act would continue for the remainder of his military career, as Ivan navigated between professional competence and political survival in a system that valued both but trusted neither completely. Something subtle but profound was happening to Ivan Kozhedub's place in Soviet military history during the 1950s and 60s. While his wartime achievements remained officially recognized, the emphasis on his individual success began to fade in favor of collective narratives that better served current political requirements. Stalin's successors preferred historical narratives that emphasized the collective struggle of the Soviet people under party leadership rather than exceptional individual performance. Heroes were still acknowledged, but within contexts that subordinated personal achievement to ideological messaging. For Ivan, this meant his record-breaking victory total and tactical innovations were gradually de-emphasized in favor of his role as representative of the broader pilot community. Official accounts stressed his typicality rather than his uniqueness, his embodiment of Soviet values rather than his transcendence of normal limitations. The change was implemented gradually. Ivan's name appeared less frequently in aviation magazines and military histories. His tactical innovations were attributed to collective development rather than individual insight. New training manuals incorporated his methods without crediting their origin. More significantly, other wartime aces began receiving greater prominence in official accounts. Alexander Pokrishkin, whose political reliability had never been questioned, became the preferred example of Soviet fighter pilot excellence. His slightly lower victory total was balanced by superior credentials as a party member and political activist. Ivan's reluctance to engage in extensive political activity now worked against him. Leaders expected military heroes to actively support party initiatives and contribute to ideological education efforts. Ivan participated in required activities, but his compliance was dutiful rather than passionate, professional rather than personal. This measured approach preserved his position within the military hierarchy while limiting his broader public profile. Ivan continued receiving promotions based on professional competence, but was no longer featured prominently in propaganda materials or held up as a model for socialist youth. The trend accelerated during the 1960s as Soviet military doctrine emphasized technological sophistication over individual pilot skill. Ivan's expertise in close-range dogfighting seemed increasingly anachronistic in an era of beyond-visual-range missile engagements. His assignments reflected this technological shift. Instead of commanding fighter units, Ivan found himself responsible for integrated air defense systems. The administrative nature of these assignments limited his visibility among younger officers who might have preserved his tactical innovations. International recognition of Ivan's achievements also began to fade. Western military historians, initially impressed by his unprecedented victory total, began questioning whether Soviet claims were reliable. Cold War tensions contributed to skepticism about Soviet military achievements in general. Ivan's response to growing obscurity was characteristically understated. He continued performing his duties with methodical precision, neither complaining about reduced recognition nor actively seeking restored prominence. His focus remained on professional competence rather than public acclaim. But the silence gathering around his achievements had implications beyond personal recognition. The tactical innovations and leadership principles he had developed were being lost as institutional memory faded, and official accounts emphasized different aspects of Soviet military history. The irony was profound. The system that had produced and initially celebrated Ivan's exceptional achievements was now systematically erasing them from collective memory. The very success that should have guaranteed his historical legacy was contributing to its dissolution. The early 1980s brought Ivan Kozhedub to the end of his military career. After 4 decades spanning the transformation from propeller-driven fighters to supersonic interceptors, he faced mandatory retirement at age 60. The ceremony marking his departure was respectful but subdued. Senior officers praised his long service and professional competence without dwelling on wartime achievements. The speeches emphasized his contribution to air defense development and training younger officers. For a man whose entire adult identity had been shaped by military service, retirement represented fundamental disruption. Ivan had never developed hobbies outside aviation. His social connections were primarily professional relationships that would fade as he moved away from active military affairs. The transition was complicated by the relative obscurity now surrounding his wartime achievements. Unlike veterans who had maintained public profiles through political activity, Ivan found himself largely forgotten by the general population. His record-breaking accomplishments were known primarily to aviation specialists. This anonymity had advantages and disadvantages. Ivan could move through civilian life without unwanted attention, but he also lacked the recognition and respect his achievements deserved. The balance between privacy and acknowledgement remained unsatisfying. Part-time consulting work with aircraft manufacturers provided both income and purpose. Ivan's practical experience offered valuable perspective for designers developing new military systems. The consulting work maintained his connection to aviation developments while allowing him to contribute based on unique experience. More significantly, retirement provided opportunities for reflection impossible during active military career. Ivan began considering the broader implications of his wartime experience and its relationship to subsequent historical developments. The pilot who had once focused exclusively on immediate tactical problems now had time to think about strategic questions and historical patterns. He began to understand how his individual achievements had contributed to broader historical forces, how his tactical innovations had influenced Soviet military doctrine far beyond his personal victory total. But he also recognized how historical narratives had been constructed to serve political rather than factual purposes. The systematic de-emphasis of his achievements reflected broader patterns of Soviet historical manipulation designed to support current political requirements rather than preserve accurate records. This understanding brought both clarity and frustration. Ivan could see how his story fit into larger patterns of individual excellence being subordinated to collective narratives, but he was powerless to correct historical distortions or ensure future generations would have access to accurate accounts. The frustration was balanced by satisfaction at having served effectively during a crucial period of human history. Whatever the subsequent political manipulation of his story, Ivan knew his actions had contributed to defeating Nazi Germany and liberating his homeland. That knowledge provided meaning transcending questions of public recognition. Ivan's retirement years also brought personal relationships impossible during active military service. Marriage to a woman who appreciated his quiet competence rather than historical achievements provided domestic stability he had never previously experienced. Health problems began affecting Ivan's later retirement years. The physical stresses of high-performance flight and psychological pressures of combat command had taken their toll. Medical treatment became increasingly important to his daily routine. The health issues served as reminders of mortality and time's passage. Ivan began considering questions of legacy and historical memory more seriously. He wondered whether future generations would understand the sacrifices made by his generation and lessons learned through terrible experience. Efforts to document his experiences met with limited success. Publishers showed little interest in memoirs that might contradict official historical narratives. Military historians had access to his records, but often lacked necessary context to understand their broader significance. Ivan's story was becoming lost not through deliberate suppression, but through natural processes of time and changing priorities. The world was moving beyond conflicts that had defined his generation toward new challenges requiring different expertise and different heroes. The silence that had been gathering around his achievements for decades was now becoming complete. Even Kozhedub's health declined steadily throughout the late 1980s. The cumulative effects of decades of high-stress military service created medical problems that increasingly limited his activities and independence. The man who had once controlled advanced fighter aircraft with precision now struggled with simple physical tasks. Walking became difficult. Vision and hearing deteriorated. The body that had withstood tremendous physical stresses of aerial combat could no longer manage routine civilian activities, but Ivan's mental acuity remained largely unaffected. He continued following developments in military aviation with keen interest, noting technological advances that had transformed air warfare since his retirement. The primitive fighters of his wartime service had evolved into sophisticated systems bearing little resemblance to the aircraft he had mastered. The end of the Cold War brought dramatic changes to the political environment that had shaped Ivan's entire adult life. The Soviet Union was collapsing under internal contradictions and external pressures. The system he had served faithfully for nearly 50 years was disintegrating before his eyes. These transformations had complex implications for Ivan's legacy. The ideological constraints that had limited discussion of individual achievements during the Soviet era were weakening. But the institutional structures that had preserved military records and maintained historical narratives were also failing. New opportunities emerged for more honest assessment of wartime achievements. Western historians gained access to Soviet archives closed for decades. Russian scholars began re-examining official narratives accepted without question for generations. But the chaos of political transition also created risks for historical preservation. Military archives were being scattered or destroyed. Veterans who might have provided first-hand accounts were dying without sharing their stories. Institutional memory was disappearing along with the institutions that had maintained it. Ivan's own situation reflected these broader challenges. He possessed unique knowledge about Soviet aviation history that could have contributed significantly to scholarly understanding. But his advanced age and declining health limited his ability to participate in historical research or documentation efforts. Occasional visitors sought information about his wartime experiences, but these contacts were sporadic and often superficial. Journalists seeking dramatic stories rather than detailed technical information. Historians whose aviation understanding was limited to theoretical knowledge. Amateur enthusiasts focused on statistics rather than broader implications. Ivan provided what assistance he could, but interviews often failed to capture the depth and complexity of his experience. The tactical innovations he had developed could not be easily communicated to those lacking practical aviation background. The strategic implications of his achievements required context that few interviewers possessed. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 occurred during Ivan's final illness. He witnessed the end of the system he had served throughout his career, but was too weak to fully comprehend the implications. The country for which he had fought and the ideology he had supported were disappearing along with his own life. Ivan Kozhedub died on August 8, 1991, just as the Soviet Union was entering its final crisis. His death received minimal public attention, occurring during overwhelming political and social upheaval. The man who had been the most successful fighter pilot in aviation history passed away in relative obscurity. The obituaries were brief, focused on official titles and awards, rather than tactical innovations or historical significance. Even sympathetic accounts struggled to convey the magnitude of his achievements to readers lacking context for understanding aerial warfare. Ivan's funeral was attended by family members and a few surviving colleagues. The ceremony was respectful but modest, reflecting both his personal preferences and the chaotic state of institutions that might have organized more elaborate proceedings. His burial in a Moscow cemetery marked the end of a remarkable life spanning military aviation's transformation from early development through its maturation as a decisive factor in modern warfare. But the location was unmarked by any monument indicating his historical significance to future visitors. The immediate aftermath brought little change in public awareness of his achievements. The political crisis consuming the Soviet Union left little attention for historical reflection or veteran recognition. More pressing concerns about economic survival and political transformation dominated public discourse. The silence that had been gathering around Ivan Kozhedub's legacy for decades was now virtually complete. The most successful fighter pilot in aviation history had died without receiving the recognition his achievements deserved. His tactical innovations were forgotten, his strategic insights were lost. But death also freed Ivan's story from the political constraints that had limited its telling during his lifetime. New opportunities would emerge for historians and researchers to examine his achievements objectively and assess their significance accurately. The process of historical rehabilitation could begin, and perhaps in time, the world would remember the village boy who looked up at the sky with wonder, decided to make it his domain, and became the silent ace whose legacy transcends the circumstances of his forgotten passing. The sky remembers, even when the world below does not, unmarked by any monument that would have indicated his historical significance to future visitors. The immediate aftermath of Ivan's death brought little change in public awareness of his achievements. The political crisis consuming the Soviet Union left little attention available for historical reflection or veteran recognition. More pressing concerns about economic survival and political transformation dominated public discourse. Even within military aviation communities, Ivan's passing was noted primarily by specialists who already understood his contributions. The broader officer corps, now focused on adapting to post-Soviet realities, had limited interest in wartime heroes whose experience seemed increasingly irrelevant to contemporary challenges. The silence that had been gathering around Ivan Kozhedub's legacy for decades was now virtually complete. The most successful fighter pilot in aviation history had died without receiving the recognition his achievements deserved. His tactical innovations were forgotten. His strategic insights were lost. His example of professional excellence under extreme pressure was no longer available to inspire future generations. But death also freed Ivan's story from the political constraints that had limited its telling during his lifetime. New opportunities would emerge for historians and researchers to examine his achievements objectively and assess their significance accurately. The process of historical rehabilitation could begin.